Emma loved exploring antique shops, always hoping to find a hidden treasure. One rainy afternoon, she wandered into a dimly lit store tucked away on a narrow street. The shop was filled with an assortment of objects: old clocks, dusty trinkets, paintings, and furniture from another era. But at the back of the room, something caught her eye: a tall, ornate mirror. It stood about 6 feet high, encased in a dark wood frame intricately carved with twisting vines and eerie symbols that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. As she approached, the shopkeeper, an elderly woman with piercing eyes, appeared at her side. "Ah, the mirror," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "A beautiful piece, isn't it? But be warned, it reflects more than just your image." Emma laughed off the warning, chalking it up to a sales tactic meant to intrigue. The mirror was stunning and unique, its surface pristine despite its apparent age. She knew it would be the perfect addition to her apartment. To her surprise, the price was far lower than she expected. She hesitated for a moment, the shopkeeper's words echoing in her mind, but quickly brushed off the unease. She paid and arranged for the mirror to be delivered. As she left the shop, she glanced back and caught sight of the mirror in the dim room. For a brief moment, she thought she saw movement in the glass, as if shadows were swirling within it. She blinked, and the reflection returned to normal. With a slight shiver, she hurried out into the rain, unaware of the darkness she had just brought into her life. When the mirror arrived at her apartment, Emma wasted no time setting it up in her bedroom. It looked even more impressive in the natural light of her room. She spent the next few minutes examining herself in it, adjusting her hair, admiring how the mirror seemed to enhance the light and space around her. It was perfect, almost too perfect. However, as the day wore on, the mirror began to feel out of place. It was as if the air around it was colder, heavier. The shadows in the room seemed to stretch and bend toward it, pulling at its base in a way that made her skin crawl. She dismissed it as her imagination running wild. After all, she was alone in a new place, and the mirror was certainly old. It was bound to have some sort of presence, but as night fell, she began to notice something unsettling. Whenever she passed by the mirror, she caught glimpses of movement. It was subtle, a flicker at the edge of her vision, like something shifting in the background. She tried to ignore it, telling herself it was just a trick of the light. But each time she walked by, the sensation grew stronger, the shadows within the glass appearing to ripple and change shape as if alive. Lying in bed that night, she turned off the lights and tried to sleep. But the room felt different, charged with an energy she couldn't explain. The mirror stood tall in the darkness, its surface reflecting the faint glow from the streetlight outside. She turned away, forcing her eyes shut, trying to calm the growing sense of dread that crept over her. Just as she began to drift off, a soft, barely audible whisper echoed in the room. Her eyes snapped open, heart pounding in her chest. She glanced at the mirror, and for a split second, she saw it. A dark figure standing behind her reflection, watching her. She gasped, sitting up in bed, but the figure was gone. It was just her reflection now, wide-eyed and fearful. In the following days, the mirror's presence became more unsettling. Emma noticed that it didn't simply reflect her image. It seemed to show things that weren't there. In the morning, she would find faint handprints on the glass, though she hadn't touched it. At night, when she turned off the lights, she would sometimes see faint, shadowy figures moving behind her reflection, disappearing the moment she turned to look. The most unnerving part was that the reflection within the mirror seemed different, almost distorted. It wasn't her reflection, not exactly. Her movements were slightly delayed, and her face appeared subtly twisted, as if the mirror was warping reality in some sinister way. She started to avoid looking directly at it, fearing what she might see. Yet, the more she tried to ignore it, the more it seemed to call out to her, demanding her attention. One evening, as she was getting ready for bed, she stood in front of the mirror, hesitating. Taking a deep breath, she decided to confront whatever was happening. She stepped closer, staring at her reflection. For a moment, nothing happened. She almost laughed at her own paranoia. But then, the glass began to fog up, as though someone were breathing on the other side. Slowly, letters started to appear, scrawled across the foggy surface. "Help me." Emma stumbled back, her heart racing. She blinked, and the message was gone. The glass was clear, showing only her own pale, terrified face. She turned on every light in the room, fear gripping her like a vice. She grabbed a cloth and wiped the mirror frantically, her hands trembling. What was happening? Was she losing her mind? Or was there something truly wrong with this mirror? The next few nights were filled with nightmares. Emma dreamed of a dark, endless hallway lined with mirrors, each one reflecting her image back at her with twisted, malevolent grins. In her dreams, the hallway would stretch out into infinity, and the reflections would reach out to her, their hands pressing against the glass as if trying to break free. During the day, the mirror became a source of anxiety. She avoided looking into it, but it was nearly impossible. It was as if it was drawing her in, compelling her to see what lay within its depths. And when she did glance at it, she was greeted with horrifying sights. She saw herself standing in dark, unfamiliar rooms, shadows creeping up behind her, hands reaching out to pull her into the glass. The visions were brief, but each one left a mark on her mind, chipping away at her sanity. One night, she woke up to the sound of glass cracking. Her heart pounding, she turned on the bedside lamp and looked at the mirror. Its surface was fractured, spiderweb-like cracks radiating from the center, yet the reflection within was undisturbed. It still showed her bedroom, but the reflection was wrong. The room was darker, and the shadows in the corners seemed to pulse and writhe. And then she saw it. Her reflection smiled, a twisted, mocking grin that sent chills down her spine. Panicking, she reached for her phone to call someone, anyone. But when she looked back at the mirror, it was whole again, the cracks gone. She stared in disbelief, her mind racing. Was the mirror playing tricks on her? Or was she beginning to lose her grip on reality? The mirror's influence on Emma grew stronger with each passing day. The atmosphere in her apartment turned heavy, the air thick and charged, like the silence before a storm. Every corner seemed darker, and the shadows stretched farther than they should. A sense of unease settled over everything, turning her once cozy home into a prison of terror. The mirror had become the focal point, an ominous presence that she couldn't ignore. It was as though the entire apartment was being swallowed by its darkness. Then came the whispers. It started as a faint rustling sound, like the distant murmur of leaves in a breeze. At first, Emma thought it was her imagination, a side effect of her growing anxiety. But the whispers soon became clearer, distinct. They filled her ears whenever she was near the mirror, a chorus of soft, disjointed voices that spoke in hushed, urgent tones. She could never quite make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, desperate, pleading, as if the voices were trapped on the other side, calling for help. One evening, she stood in front of the mirror, her heart racing as the whispers grew louder. The room around her dimmed, the lights flickering as shadows crept along the walls. She stared at her reflection, feeling the pull of the mirror's power. The whispers turned into a cacophony, filling her mind with a sense of dread so profound it made her dizzy. In the glass, she saw movement, faint shadows swirling in the background, twisting and turning like wraiths. Her reflection blurred, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she saw herself not in her apartment, but standing in a dark, narrow hallway lined with mirrors. The walls were ancient, cracked, and covered in faint markings. The floor was littered with shattered glass, and the air around her was icy cold. She felt the presence of something behind her, a shadow that loomed closer. She tried to turn around, but her reflection remained still, staring out with wide, terrified eyes. Suddenly, the whispers rose to a scream, piercing through her thoughts. Emma staggered back, clutching her head as the room around her snapped back into focus. The mirror returned to its usual reflection, her apartment, her pale face staring back at her. The whispers ceased, leaving only a deafening silence in their wake. She collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, her mind reeling from what she had just experienced. The mirror had shown her something, a glimpse into its dark world, a place that wasn't just a reflection but a reality all its own. The days dragged on in a haze of fear and confusion. Emma tried to live her life, to go about her daily routine, but the mirror haunted her every step. Its influence spread throughout the apartment. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and the once familiar rooms now felt foreign, hostile. It was as if the mirror had taken over, warping her reality to mirror its own dark world. She could no longer sleep peacefully. Every night, she was plagued by nightmares of the hallway from her vision. In her dreams, she wandered through the endless corridor, mirrors lining both sides. Each mirror showed different versions of her, some distorted, others weeping or screaming silently. In the distance, she would hear faint footsteps, growing louder, closer, as if something was following her. She would run, but the hallway stretched on, with no end in sight. When she awoke, she felt an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, as if the nightmares were sapping her strength, pulling her deeper into the mirror's grasp. During the day, she avoided the mirror, but it was impossible to escape its influence. When she walked through the apartment, she felt its gaze on her, an unseen force that watched her every move. The shadows in the room twisted and writhed, taking on shapes that made her skin crawl. Sometimes, out of the corner of her eye, she saw reflections in other surfaces, windows, picture frames, that didn't match what was in the room. In the reflection, she would catch a glimpse of darkened walls, fogged glass, and shadowy figures moving toward her. One afternoon, driven to the edge of sanity, she grabbed a cloth and draped it over the mirror, hoping to block out whatever evil lurked within. The room immediately felt lighter, the air less oppressive. She sighed in relief, thinking she might have finally found some way to contain its power. But as the hours passed, the whispers began anew, more insistent and demanding than ever. The cloth rustled as if moved by an unseen hand, and she swore she heard faint scratching coming from beneath it, like nails scraping against glass. Her phone buzzed, startling her out of her fear-induced trance. It was a message from a friend she hadn't spoken to in weeks. "Are you okay? I had the strangest dream about you. There was a mirror, and you were trapped inside, calling for help." The message sent chills down her spine. She didn't know how to respond. How could she explain what was happening without sounding insane? She glanced at the covered mirror, a sinking feeling of dread filling her stomach. It was trying to pull her in, to trap her just like in her friend's dream. The next few days were a blur of paranoia and dread. Emma kept the mirror covered, but its presence still loomed over her. The whispering grew louder, more coherent, and she could make out snippets of words. Come, trapped, help me. It wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, a multitude of souls calling to her from the depths of the glass. She began to understand that the mirror wasn't just cursed. It was a prison, a vessel for whatever malevolent entity had been bound within it. Driven by a mixture of fear and curiosity, she began to research the mirror's origins. She scoured old records, antique catalogs, and forums dedicated to the paranormal. After days of searching, she found a fragment of information, a legend about a mirror crafted centuries ago by a dark sorcerer. It was said that the mirror could capture souls, trapping them in an endless cycle of torment. Those who looked into it would see not just their reflection, but glimpses of the sorrows and fears of the souls imprisoned within. The legend spoke of a ritual to break the mirror's curse, a dangerous process that could free the souls trapped inside, but only if performed correctly. If failed, it would doom the performer to become part of the mirror's realm forever. Emma read and reread the passage, her hands trembling. It was a risk, but what choice did she have? She couldn't go on living like this, and she refused to become another victim of the mirror. That night, she gathered the items needed for the ritual: candles, salt, a silver knife, and a bowl of water. The instructions were specific and complex, requiring her to perform the ritual at the stroke of midnight, under a moonless sky. She arranged the candles around the mirror, tracing a circle of salt on the floor to contain whatever might be unleashed. With her heart pounding in her chest, she began the incantation. Her voice wavered as she spoke the ancient words, feeling a rush of cold air fill the room. The candle flames flickered, and the whispers grew into a cacophony, echoing off the walls and invading her mind. She glanced at the covered mirror, and in the dim candlelight, she saw the cloth begin to stir, as if something beneath it was moving, trying to escape. She took a deep breath, grabbed the cloth, and pulled it away. The mirror's surface rippled, shadows swirling within its depths. Her reflection appeared, distorted and grim, and behind her, she saw countless faces, twisted, anguished faces pressing against the glass, eyes wide with terror. They moved, shifting as if trying to break free. The whispers turned into cries, a chorus of voices pleading for release. The room around her darkened, the candle flames guttering out one by one. Panic surged through her as the mirror began to glow, an eerie, silvery light that spilled across the floor, illuminating the shadowy faces within. The air grew colder, freezing, and she felt a force pulling at her, dragging her toward the glass. She stumbled back, struggling against the pull, the incantation faltering on her lips. The light from the mirror grew brighter, blinding her. In that moment, she realized the ritual was failing. The mirror wasn't releasing its prisoners. It was trying to claim her as its next victim. Emma struggled to stay on her feet as the force from the mirror pulled at her with an almost physical grip. The room was now bathed in an otherworldly, silvery light that emanated from the glass, casting twisted shadows on the walls. The faces in the mirror pressed closer, their mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with fear and desperation. They were close enough to touch, their forms blurring and shifting within the swirling darkness of the mirror's depths. The pull grew stronger, like a gust of wind trying to drag her into the abyss. She stumbled, her hands scrabbling for something to hold on to, but there was nothing to grasp. It was as if the entire room had become an extension of the mirror's power. She felt herself being dragged forward, inch by inch, toward the glowing surface. Panic surged through her as the mirror's light intensified, surrounding her like a cold fog, chilling her to the bone. "No, I won't let you take me," she screamed, her voice echoing off the walls, mingling with the cries from within the mirror. With a last burst of strength, she grabbed the silver knife, the final part of the ritual. Raising it high, she slashed the blade across her palm, blood welling up instantly. She pressed her hand against the mirror, smearing it with crimson. The effect was immediate. The mirror's surface sizzled and hissed, the blood seeping into the glass like ink on paper. The faces within the mirror recoiled, their forms distorting in agony. The whispers turned into a deafening wail, a sound so piercing that it made Emma's ears ring. The pull weakened, and she felt the force around her lessen. For a moment, it seemed as though the ritual might be working, that the mirror was being forced to release its captives. But then, the wailing stopped. The faces in the mirror ceased their movements, their eyes locking onto her with an unsettling calm. A wave of cold air blasted out from the mirror, throwing her backward, knocking the candles over and extinguishing their flames. Darkness engulfed the room, save for the mirror's faint, silvery glow. She looked up in horror to see her reflection in the mirror, standing still and staring back at her. The reflection's eyes gleamed with a malevolent light, a twisted grin spreading across its face. The mirror had fought back. It had refused to let go. The ritual had failed. Emma lay on the floor, gasping for breath, her eyes fixed on the mirror. Its glow began to fade, the swirling shadows within settling into a calm, smooth surface. But her reflection remained, staring at her with an expression that didn't match her own. It grinned, its eyes gleaming with a mixture of triumph and malice. Slowly, it raised its hand, mimicking her earlier motion. She felt a chill run down her spine as she realized it wasn't a reflection anymore. It was something else, something using her image to mock her. With trembling hands, she pushed herself up, backing away from the mirror. The room felt colder, darker. The whispering had returned, faint and distorted, echoing from within the glass. She turned to run, to escape this nightmare, but froze when she saw her own reflection in the window pane. The figure in the window was not her. It was the same twisted version from the mirror, grinning back at her from every reflective surface in the room. "No, no, no," she muttered, shaking her head as she stumbled toward the door. She reached for the handle, her hand trembling uncontrollably. But when she opened the door, she didn't see the hallway of her apartment. Instead, she saw the dark, endless corridor from her dreams, lined with mirrors on both sides. Each mirror reflected the same distorted version of herself, each one grinning, mocking, pulling her deeper into the madness. She slammed the door shut, her heart racing. The apartment around her was warping, bending to the will of the mirror's curse. Every surface seemed to glisten with a faint reflection, each one showing glimpses of the twisted realm within the mirror. Shadows danced along the walls, growing and stretching toward her like black vines, creeping closer with each passing second. Emma turned back to the mirror, her chest heaving with fear and desperation. It stood there, calm and quiet, its surface now a smooth, polished black. No faces, no figures, just an endless void staring back at her. She felt the pull again, the overwhelming urge to look deeper, to step closer, to see what lay beyond the darkness. "Please," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Let me go." But the mirror remained silent, its surface rippling slightly as if in response to her plea. She felt the room closing in on her, the shadows tightening around her like a noose. The mirror's power surged, drawing her closer until she was standing just inches away from its surface. She reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the glass. It was cold, so cold that it burned her skin. The mirror rippled beneath her touch, and she felt herself being pulled forward, sinking into the darkness. With a final, desperate scream, she was engulfed by the mirror's surface. The world around her twisted and shattered, breaking into fragments of light and shadow. She felt herself falling, spinning through an abyss, the whispers filling her mind with chaos and fear. And then, everything went silent. She opened her eyes to find herself standing in a dim, narrow hallway. Mirrors lined both sides, stretching into darkness. In each mirror, she saw her own image, distorted and twisted, grinning back at her. She tried to turn around, to run, but found herself trapped. The mirrors stretched endlessly in all directions, an infinite maze of reflections that mocked her every move. She was inside the mirror now, a prisoner in its world, just another face among the countless souls it had claimed over the centuries. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness, echoing back to her as a faint whisper. In the real world, the mirror in her apartment stood quietly, its surface now smooth and dark, with no reflection visible. The room around it was still, the air heavy with an unnatural silence. And if one were to look closely at the mirror, they might see it. The faint outline of a face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide with terror, lips moving in a silent plea for help. The mirror had claimed another victim, and now, it waited for the next curious soul to gaze into its depths. If this story gave you chills, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more spine-tingling tales. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss out on our next eerie encounter. Have you ever had an experience with a mirror that made your blood run cold? Share your story in the comments. We'd love to hear about your own reflections of fear. And if you enjoyed this tale, give us a thumbs up to let us know. Thank you for joining us in this journey into darkness. Until next time, be careful where you cast your reflection. You never know what might be staring back.